Hi everyone, let's take a look at making a simple elevator for our game. So what I have is very simple setup. This is the elevator. It is literally just a box on the ground at this point. The boxes around it aren't really part of it. They're just there to make it look kind of cool. What I do have is I have switches. So I've made this elevator button effectively that allows us to be able to bring it up and down. So let's take a look at what it does. I'm going to go Alt P and go into play mode. So you have to have a playable character. I can step onto the elevator. It triggers. It actually has a little bit of a delay. Allows us to be able to step off and step back on, and it'll delay and then trigger and make us go to the bottom. I have a button that is able to be set up in different settings. This one over here only brings it down. So you'll notice it's currently at the bottom. Let's run to the top. And we have a button at the top, and it's been set to bring the elevator up. And so that brings the elevator up. If I jump off and go and press the button that brings it to the bottom, it'll bring to the bottom. And then I have another one that's been set to both basically. So it'll send it up and it'll send it down. Doesn't matter where it is, it'll send it in both directions. So let's go about starting to set up the simple elevator itself, and then we'll talk about how to set up buttons later, because that's a little trickier to get working. So I want to hit escape and just get out of the play mode. And in my actor demo BP, yours should be obviously in your actor BP, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say blueprint class and choose actor blueprint. And this is going to be BP elevator demo in my case, because I already have an elevator in here. And then we're going to double click on it to open it up. Just opened on my other screen. There we go. And so blueprints have three main components. I guess you could see the viewport, construction script, and the event graph. So starting with the event graph, this is what actually fires the animation. This is what's happening when we're playing our game. The construction script is there for the setup. Now, so what I have is all sorts of setup going on here. One, I have a start at top, which means that it forces the elevator up to the top to start at the top at the beginning of play. Which means I can also then use my max elevator height here, and I can determine how high my elevator is going to travel. So I can set it up. I can leave it at the top, or again, in my case, I left it at the bottom, so the elevator was down at the bottom. And then I've got a couple other things. I've got the speed the elevator travels at. We have a delay I put in here. So in this case, half a second delay before it starts moving. I have also a collision size. So this is the size of this yellow box here, and that's the thing that triggers the elevator. And then I've got a collision height. We may not get to putting those in because it's just sort of more of the same kind of thing, but some nice settings for the end user. So let's go back to our elevator blueprint. And sorry, I'm just going Control Shift S all the time to make sure I save things. And let's build this up. So first we need our components. So one of the first things we add, or we're going to add in this case, is going to be what's called a scene node. I'll use them. And this is just like an invisible node. And we're going to use this to be our elevator transform. This is like kind of doing a character rig in a sense, except this is just the node that's going to have all of the animation on it. That way, any of the geometry we use or any other elements can just be parented up to it. We can swap out geometry as needed. So the next one we're going to need is going to be a static mesh. Now I've already brought into my scene a box. I'm going to use that in a second, but I'm going to call this elevator base. And over in the static property here, I'm going to set that to be elevator base. And the elevator base is now going to show up in the scene as just a box. So this is what we've got now. The transform node you don't really see. It's this right here. So it's just going to go up and down. And so we're going to be able to move that up and down during the, when somebody steps on it. We're going to need one more thing, and that's going to be parented onto the transform, and that is going to be a collision, a box collision. So we're going to place that into the scene here, and we're going to call this elevator trigger. And we want it parented up to the transform. So if it's come in and you've got it in the wrong place, we don't want it parented up to the base, because for some reason we decide we want to swap this out or change it. We don't want it to have an effect on anything else. So I'm just going to drag that onto the transform. So now the transform moves and everything moves. You can see that the collision object's kind of buried down there. I'm going to move it up. And this is going to be the thing that triggers the elevator. So they need to run into this. So we actually have to have stepped onto the elevator all the way. So the size of this will kind of matter as to how well it works. We'll just leave it like that now, and it should be fine. So the next thing we want to do is we want to set up a construction script so that we can start controlling some of the things. And first thing we need to be able to control is how high the elevator is going to travel. So over here in variables, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this elevator height. And with elevator height, I'm going to make sure it's visible. And if that eyeball's on, then it shows up here, okay, as a setting that they can set. And we have to set the type. Currently, right now, variable type is Boolean. We can either change it by clicking on this or clicking up here and selecting it. We want a float value. So a float value is a value that has, any sort of decimal place. So 1.0 is a float value. 1 is an integer. It's a whole number. So that's called an integer. We need things, values that can have decimal places. So 1.395, that's a float value again. So we've set it to be a float value. And I'm going to drag this out into the construction script and let go. We have two options, get and set. Get and set. So get will get the value that's being stored here. Set will allow us to set the value back in here. We don't want to set. Another way we can do that that's going to speed things up, that I'll do it from here on in. Control drag out is get. Alt drag out is set. Okay, so just to make our lives faster. So we want to get this value. Now there is no default value yet. If you look over here in the details panel, it says please compile the blueprint to be able to set it. So compile, and there's our elevator height. Let's set it to like a default height of 500. Again, the user will be able to change that at will. Now, what are we setting the height on? That's going to be the elevator transform. So I'm going to drag that out, and this is a reference to the elevator transform node. And what do I want to be able to do with that? I want to be able to set its relative location. So I'm going to drag out of the pin out of elevator transform and say set relative location. We can see it here. Now, relative meaning that we want to set it relative to its parent. Okay, so it's going to be setting it relative to the default scene root. This is this sort of white object that vanishes when we hit play. Okay, and the construction script is fired whenever the user, the developer, sort of the person putting together the level, interacts with it and does anything. This construction script is then fired. So we need to fire that event when we interact with it, and then it's going to fire this function, which is called set relative location. It's going to set the relative location on the transform of this object, our elevator transform, and this will be the new location. So we need to pipe this value in. If you notice, the colors aren't the same. And we also don't want to set it in X and Y, only Z. So let's right click on the pin and say split struct pin. So it splits them out into 3 inputs instead of 1. And then we can plug that value in here. I'm going to hit compile and go and take a look, and you'll now notice that my elevator is 500 units up in the air. Okay, so it's pushed this elevator transform node way up in the air. If we move out here and drag it out, okay, we'll notice it's also up in the air. Okay, so we can adjust now how high it's going to be. I'll just leave it at 500 so we know what's going on. But it would be nice if we had some way of being able to toggle it to be at the top or bottom. So we're going to add that so that it isn't just forced up here as soon as we add it to the scene. So the variables, again, we're going to add a new variable. This is going to be called start at top. I'm going to make that visible. And again, we need to change the type. This time we're going to change it to a Boolean value. A Boolean value is a true false or an on-off type value. So it's true false. So back over to our construction script. And now in here, I'm going to use an if statement, or in this case, it's called a branch. And we're going to use this start at top value to be able to drive that. So I'm going to do a get and get the Boolean value. And I'm going to drag out of the construction script and type branch. Now you can also type if you're used to that in programming, and it'll get to it as well. So it's basically an if statement in every other programming language. So the condition, true or false, so that's going to be our input from the user. So it's going to be true or false. And if it is true, so start at top, go ahead and set the elevator height. So if I compile again, and you'll now notice that the start at top default is false, we can see that the default is down at the bottom and back into our level again. And you can see start at top. And if we check that on, it pops up to the top. We can go ahead and set the height to whatever we want it to be, turn it back off, or leave it as a starting point up at the top again, however we want to do it. I'm going to leave it off, and I'm just going to save again. So that gives us that ability to be able to control this as to whether or not it's going to be up or down. So next thing, let's get our elevator functioning. Okay, so over in our event graph, we have these events that are going to be triggered on certain events that, in this case, begin play. So if, when you start playing the game, this gets fired and then we can do stuff, or overlapping some actors. So, one thing overlaps another, or event tick, which is literally just time going by. If we want to just keep driving something all the time, we could use the event tick. We don't need any of those. I'm just going to push up, and I'm going to go get the elevator, just select the elevator trigger here and scroll right to the bottom in the details panel. And we can make events for it. So in this case, we want an on component begin overlap. So when the player overlaps with this, let's do something. So I'm going to click and create that event. So we have this new event, and it has a bunch of outputs, and we're not going to actually use any of them. Now, what do we want to do again? Well, we want to be able to control that elevator transform. So we're going to need it. We're going to need the height that we're going to drive it up to. Okay. And we're going to push it up to the top, and we're not going to worry about the start at top at this point. It's only going to go up as we start out. Now, what are we going to do? Same thing. We're going to say set relative location again. Of course, when this gets triggered, it's going to fire this function. And again, we're going to split the struct pin on the location, and we're going to plug in the elevator height. So what should happen now is when we interact with it, it should just jump. It should just fly up in the air instantaneously and set it above our heads. So I'm just going to hit compile, and I'm going to go get my player start and just move it over so it's easy to see this. And I'm going to go Alt-P, and so there it is on the ground. As the light comes in, I'm going to step on it, and it goes flying up in the air. Now, why didn't we go up with it? Well, that's because it literally just set it. It went from being on the ground to being in the air. It didn't even pass through us. It just changed its position instantaneously. So hit escape. Let's get out of there. Actually, I'm going to move both of those into the light a bit so we can see them a bit better. So now what we need to do is we need to make it travel up slowly. So I'm just going to move these down, and we're going to create another node in here. And this is going to be a node called timeline. And it's add timeline. You can see it at the bottom there. And it creates this timeline node. So we're going to name this elevator animation. And what we want to do is we want to fire this and play it from the start. You're going to find in a second. And when it's updating, then we're going to go ahead and fire our relative location. So what's the timeline? Double click on it, and it's going to open up another tab here. So we've got our construction script, our event graph, our viewport, and our elevator animation node here. Now, what this allows us to do is create function curves, or splining. It's seems to be referred to now as, but they're referred to as function curves. Hence the F here, float track. We have a vector track, an event track, and I forget what this one is, a color track. So we're going to go with a float track. We just need a value to push it up. That creates this graph here where we can place animation. Now you'll notice it happens over 5 seconds. The graph currently length is 5. We don't want that. We just want it to be 1. And we're going to create a curve in here that goes from a value of 0 to a value of 1 only. Okay, so I'm going to say add key to float, and we're going to take those key values, we're going to change them to 0, 0, so it's at the beginning. I'm just going to drop another one in there, and this is going to be a value of 1, 1. So this is going to be used as a multiplier. Multiply something by 0. In this case, our elevator height, we get 0 at the bottom. Multiply our elevator height by 1, and we'll get the full value of our elevator height, currently defaulting at 500. Now, it also would be nice if we had a nice curve in this. The elevator shouldn't be a linear motion. It should speed up from the bottom and then slow down at the top. So I'm going to right click, and we can just say auto. And then we can go ahead and flatten that curve and flatten this one so that we have an ease out and an ease in on this curve. Now, this curve itself is an output, so it's currently called new track. And the only way you can rename this new track, put your mouse over it and press F2, and it will highlight it to be able to give you that information. So I'm just going to call this elevator up. Okay, so it's pushing the elevator up in this case. I'm just going to hit compile again, step back over to our event graph. So you'll now notice we have this output called elevator up. Yes, that is this curve that's coming out of there, and it's going to happen over this amount of time, okay, which is going to be 1 second, and it's going to go to a value of 0 to 1 with this nice function curve in it. So now that is going to go up. Now this elevator value is returning, it's going to return that value of that curve. So we're going to take our elevator height and we're going to multiply it by our elevator up value. So I'm going to drag that out, and I'm just going to go and do Shift 8, or the star, the asterisk, and it'll get us to all of the mathematics for multiplying. And we want to multiply float times float. So we have a float value here, and we want to multiply the two together and plug it into the z. So now we're going to be multiplying this value with this one that goes from 0 to 1. We're going to hit compile. We're going to go back to our game, Alt-P for play, step onto it, and we go moving up. Okay, so now we're moving up. We have no way of getting it back to the bottom again. And we need to be able to trigger that to come back down again. But to be able to do that, we kind of need to know where it's going to go up to. So I'm going to use my at top, kick it back to the top, and I'm just going to go in and create an object here. Let's drag out a cube or a plane. A plane might do it actually. And we're just use that as a platform to step out onto, so we have something to get off on and get back onto it again. Okay, so there's our plane. So set it back to the bottom again for our animation, Alt-P, so we'll be able to step onto it, step off of it, and now we want to be able to fire it again. But you notice it suddenly just went flying back to the bottom again. So as soon as we hit that trigger, what's happened is it has triggered the event overlap on that trigger, which has fired our elevator animation and play from start. And immediately what's now happening is that it's going right to the bottom again to the value of 0 and then playing through that again. So we're going to need a reverse from end capability. So we want to know that the elevator is now at the top. And so we're going to create another variable, and this variable is not actually going to be seen. We just want a variable that we can set when we know the elevator is at the top or bottom. So I'm going to call this variable at bottom. Okay, it's going to be a Boolean again, so we already have the right type of value. It's red, so it's Boolean, but it doesn't need to be visible to the end user. I'm just going to change the order of these by dragging them around. Um, and just I may as well cover this now. We can also put them into categories just like you can in materials. Um, we'll just call that settings, spell it right maybe. And now you can either go in and add the others two settings, or you can just drag them in to it and set the order you want. So this at bottom one really doesn't need to be in there. It doesn't matter where it is. But this one is going to hold that value now. We want a default value of this at bottom. Yes, it's at the bottom. And so when the elevator moves up to the top and this finishes, you'll notice there's a finished output here. This is then going to allow us to be able to go in and set something once it's finished. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this value. So if you remember, Alt drag out is set, and I'm going to say finished, and it's going to be at bottom now becomes true. Okay. So, well, what happens if we then go back to the bottom again? We need to set it back to true. And how do we know that? Well, the direction is actually giving us that information. So I'm going to drag out of here, and it's, I believe it's called enum. I think it's this one, direction, timeline direction. Oop, no. Oh, sorry, switch. Yeah, switch on enum timeline direction. So this switch on enum direction is actually going to get fired when it finishes. And if you notice, it's connected up to the direction. And what this does is it'll know which way, which direction this animation has been played in. Because if you notice, we have reverse from end as well. So if it's been gone forward, which is up, let's set this to be the at bottom is now going to be false. And I'm going to control W and make it, and then, so if it's at bottom, it's going to be true. If it's gone backwards, and let me just confirm that, yes, it's at bottom by default. So this is going to set this value, this Boolean value, back and forth between true and false, depending on where it gets to, which then means we can use it to determine whether or not we should go forward or backwards here. So we need another branch node. So I'm going to say branch, and we're going to branch, and we're going to branch on what? We're going to branch on at bottom. So I'm going to plug that in. You can also just drag it and drop it right onto it. So if we're at bottom, true, as we're going to start, let's play from the start. Let's go up. If we're not at the bottom, false, let's go reverse from end. So I'm going to hit compile, step over to the game, and I'm going to hit play again. Now I can step onto it, step off. The elevator's now at the top. It now takes me back to the bottom again. So really, that is, in a nutshell, a working elevator. It's going to have some issues, like if you run across it, whoops, our elevator just vanished on us. It's up top, and we have no way of getting it back down again. And that's going to require some buttons and whatnot to be able to control that. So the next thing we might want to be able to do is we can control the height, how high it goes now, but how fast does it move? Right now we are limited by how fast this plays. Now we could increase or decrease that timeline, but it doesn't give the user really any chance. Now there's this new time input, and somehow I've never been able to understand what that's actually for, because it doesn't seem to do anything in my tests. Here's how we're going to have to change it up. And we're not going to do it. I was about to do it in the event graph. We're going to do it in the construction script. We're going to set the speed of this in the construction script ahead of time. So how fast do we want this to travel? And you'll be able to see why this works. And it's a bit, it's a bit different to understand how these things connect, but I'll try and explain it all. So we're going to need a node called set play rate. And I may have to turn off set context sensitive here. So if you scroll down, you'll be able to see the different things: components, flipbook, timeline. So what we want is a set play rate on a timeline node. That's the one that's at our animation node there. So I'm going to add this in. Now this can get placed in here anywhere we want. We could hook this in, but it can start becoming really messy if we just start adding things onto the end or in the, it just starts getting messy. So I want to use another one, and we're going to sort of be able to break this out and do one thing after another. This is setting the location in our construction script, but what I'm going to do is go in and select this and say, type in sequence. So sequence node will allow us to be able to break up these. And so we can have these different outputs going on now. And you can see that we can create as many of these as we want. If you make one and don't want it, right click, you can say remove. And if you want one in between, right click and you can insert one before or after the one you've clicked on. So this is the set play rate node. Now we need a rate. How fast do we want to go up and down here in this case? So I'm going to create another variable here, and it's going to be called maybe just speed. And once again, it's the wrong type. It's coming as a Boolean. We want it to be a float again, and I'm going to drag it up into the settings area here. I'm going to make it visible. I'm going to compile, and maybe, I don't know, 200 or something I think I was using. So you'll notice when I compile, we get an error here. It's needing inputs. So one, it's going to need this new rate. So I'm going to do a get, control drag out, and we could plug that directly in here. Okay. If I compile, still getting an error. It needs this target node input into here. And the target node is this timeline node that we called elevator animation, this one here. So we need to reference that. So what we can do then is we can drag out and we can type in the name that we named it. And you can see it says BP Elevator Demo. That's the name of our blueprint. And it is a get or a set for that timeline node. We want to get it, so we want to get the reference to it. And this is a direct reference to this timeline node. Okay, so it's putting it into it. Now, if I compile, it says okay. Now, the speed is kind of not a good way to put this in, because if you think about an elevator going up and down, if the elevator goes up one floor and that's all it can do is go up 100 units, it doesn't matter if it goes up 1,000 units, it should travel at the same speed. So the problem here is it's the speed, really, the length of time right now it takes from top to bottom. So we're going to we're going to have to completely change the speed depending on whether or not we have a tall elevator or a short elevator. So easy way around that. We're going to take our max height. I'm going to get and drag that out. So this is the height the elevator can go, and we're going to divide one by the other. So I'm just going to go in and press the / down there, float divide by float. So let's divide those into one another and then take the output in the rate. So how high is it going is going to get divided into the speed we're going at. So now we'll be able to go over to our elevator, and its current speed is 200. We're going 500 units high. Let's jump on there and see what happens. We travel at about that rate. Okay, so I'll just escape and let's change the elevator height to 2,000, and we'll do that test again and see if we travel at the same rate. And we're going at the same rate. It's just that we're going further up. We're going higher up in the sky now. So now we have the ability to set at the top or the bottom, the speed, the elevator height. So we have the basics of it in a half an hour. So I'm going to do a second video that's going to discuss some extras and allow you to be able to control it in other ways, because you're going to find some issues with this, as we pointed out already. It's going to work most of the time, but there are going to be ways you're going to say, hey, what just happened really shouldn't have. Also, is there a way to be able to trigger it to move up and down while you're not on it, so that you can bring the elevator back down to you? So we'll cover that next.